Good evening. This is The Big Story. I'm Olivia Quay with Dylan Ang coming to you live from the Straits Times newsroom. Now ahead on the show, we discuss which seats to look out for in the Singapore general election and the unknowns when it comes to campaigning amid COVID-19.
But first, we go stateside, where a clinical trial of a vaccine to protect against the coronavirus begins today. Citing public health officials, the Associated Press reported it would take from a year to 18 months to fully validate any potential vaccine. The report also stated that 45 young and healthy volunteers will be tested with varying doses of the vaccine shots. Both New York City and Los Angeles have shut down bars, restaurants and other public places, while in Las Vegas, MGM resorts have closed casinos and hotels until further notice.
Meanwhile, Italy suffered a spike in coronavirus deaths with 368 fatalities, the most there in a single day. It also brings the total death toll in Italy to over 1,800. Italy currently has close to 25,000 confirmed cases. The Vatican took the drastic step of cancelling Easter week celebrations that were to begin on April 5th.
France and Spain have also joined Italy in imposing lockdowns on tens of millions of people to curb the virus spread. Spain has almost 8,000 confirmed cases with close to 300 deaths. And France has close to 5,500 total infections and more than 120 people have died.
Meanwhile, Britain is set to isolate those aged over 70 for up to 4 months. The government will also force people into quarantine if they are diagnosed with the coronavirus. Around 1,400 have been hit with the virus in the UK and 35 people have died. The Straits Times Deputy Foreign Editor Bhagya Srigareka joins us now to share more on the situation in the UK. So Bhagya, Lawrence Wong said yesterday that countries like the UK have abandoned any measure to contain or restrain the virus. How does the UK's approach compare to other places that have similar infection rates?
Okay, so I have the latest figures for you. Basically, in UK you have 35 deaths and 1,400 cases. In Italy, you have 1,800 deaths, 24,000 cases. So, these are different stages of the epidemic, it looks like. So the measures appear to be different. In Italy, we saw really stringent measures. The entire country basically is in a lockdown. So you've had all the shops closed, you have only the groceries and I think the pharmacies which are open. You have people confined at home, all the schools, universities closed. That's the situation in Italy. Whereas in UK, I think they have the kind of measures in place which we've seen in Singapore in the earlier phase of the epidemic. So you have things like people being told to be careful about their personal hygiene, stay at home if you're not well, and things of that sort, which we've seen here in Singapore as well. We have not seen the kind of things you're seeing elsewhere in Europe. You're not seeing a ban so far in mass gatherings.
Yep.
You are seeing some stray, school closures in the UK, some stray pub closures, but not nationwide measures. I think what would qualify as stringent is something that's been talked about, but only talked about, not enforced. So this is the health secretary basically saying that for people who are over 70, and these are people who are vulnerable, right?
Yes.
So for them, they are looking at home isolation. But then again, this is not enforced. At the moment, it's social distancing which is enforced.
Yes.
So yes, you can see the measures are really quite different.
It's a good sign that, because initially the government was advocating a herd immunity tactic, but it's a good sign that they're moving away from that.
Well, actually, that's a bit controversial. They've said that they never at any point did talk about herd immunity. So the controversy basically is that herd immunity is the kind of thing that applies if you have a large part of the population which is somehow immune to it. And that happens if vaccination is in place. Whereas you have people who are, say, in the older category and who will not have that kind of immunity. And that's why you choose to, isolate them or cocoon them, as they say. But UK officially has not said they will look at herd immunity. I know that's been discussed and several British papers have talked about it, but officially that's not their policy.
I see. Well, we know that from 11:59 p.m. tonight, all travellers entering Singapore with recent travel history to the UK, among other countries, within the last 14 days will be issued with a 14-day stay-home notice. What does this mean for Singapore students in the UK, whether you're full-time or on exchange? Will they be sent back?
So if you're an exchange student from one of the 6 Singapore universities, you have been asked to come back. And if you should land at midnight tonight or after, then definitely you have to face that 14-day stay-at-home notice. No getting around that. But if you're a full-time student, in one of the UK universities, then I guess there's no requirement as yet. You can make your own choice. But again, if you do come after midnight, yes, you will face that same 14 days.
So you were talking about, pubs, restaurants closing down in the UK, but how close is the whole of the UK close to shutting down?
No, there are just stray closures. So some private schools, for instance, closed down. I think there was a case where, and this was a few weeks ago, where there was, I think, some batch of students who came back, after a holiday in Italy, and then, as a precautionary measure, and Italy was of course already in the throes of an epidemic. Yeah. So I guess as a precautionary thing, they did close down a few private schools. But there haven't been, like nationwide school closures, the kind you're seeing elsewhere. You've seen in rest of Europe. You're seeing in a lot of American systems as well. But that's not the case in, in UK. And so if you're asking about a nationwide slowdown, lockdown, that doesn't seem to be the case right now. So, in the next few hours, you will have the UK advisor to the Prime Minister making some fresh announcements on coronavirus. So if there's anything of that sort, which seems doubtful, it would be announced in the next few hours. And the other thing they've done, I think, as a signal to sort of, to show that they're very serious about this, because there have been criticisms against the UK government that they aren't doing things seriously enough or transparently enough. So I guess to address those things, they have committed to daily briefings like we have here in Singapore. Yeah. So that might be addressed by the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, or you might have one of his senior cabinet ministers addressing it. And I think in the longer term, they also have some laws they're looking to move in Parliament, and that might have, that could result in a ban on mass gatherings, or it could be things which will allow the government to enforce quarantine measures, but that's a little further off. So let's wait and see what they have, lined up for today.
Right. Well, let's talk about the US now. As of Sunday night, more than 30 states out of 50 had announced statewide school closures. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention also recommended that no gatherings with more than 50 people take place for the next 8 weeks. That's right. So what is the situation there? Do you see the US closing down as well?
Right. So this morning, I'm sure you heard New York Mayor Bill de Blasio basically talking about closing down restaurants and bars. Yep. So again, this is because US does have a significant number of cases, and they fear a lot more which are undetected so far. So it's towards these, to address those kind of concerns that they've announced restaurants closures, they've announced even theaters, nightclubs, all these to be closed down as well. And I think the bigger one, and especially for parents, would be the schools. Yep. So you have New York, which is one of the biggest public school systems in America. They have like 1 million students, and they will have to be staying home, I think, for a month at least. And you've got other cities as well. You've got LA, Los Angeles, which has similar requirements. You have a lot of retailers. I think if you were to stop by in Starbucks, you couldn't sit in and sip coffee anymore. You would have to take it away. So those kind of requirements have come into place as, the worry about it is growing quite a bit.
Right. Well, thank you so much for coming on to tell us more. That was Bhagya Gareka, who's Deputy Foreign Editor at the Straits Times. We want to hear from you as well. Do comment below on what you think other countries are doing to slow the spread of COVID-19. But for now, it's over to Dylan.
Back home, it was announced today that mosques in Singapore will remain closed for a further 9 days until March 26. That completes one incubation cycle period. The extension means Friday prayers on March 20th will be suspended. Singapore confirmed 14 new coronavirus cases last night, the highest number of new cases reported in a single day. There are now 226 infections in total here. Of the 14 new cases, 9 are imported, while another 3 are linked to previous cases. The remaining 2 patients are linked to the private dinner function at Safra Jurong. Yesterday, Singapore also announced further measures to reduce importation of coronavirus cases.
Today, with immediate effect, we are putting out an advisory for all Singaporeans to defer non-essential travel abroad to all countries. Besides those returning from overseas, we have also had a number of cases from Asean countries, from our neighbors, including a few that came with the very specific purpose of seeking medical care here. And it is really hard for us to cope with this additional demand during this critical period when our healthcare resources are already stretched. And so from 16th of March 2359, the task force has decided to put in place a new stay-at-home requirement for all travelers coming back from UK, Switzerland, Japan, and ASEAN countries. In other words, anyone with recent travel history in these countries will have to effectively self-quarantine for 14 days at their place of residence. It could be their home or it could be a hotel, and they have to stay there for a full 14 days. For nationals of ASEAN countries, we will have an additional requirement, which is that they will have to submit health information to our overseas missions, and this will have to be approved by the Ministry of Health before they travel.
But these restrictions will exclude Singaporeans and Malaysians using sea and land crossings with Malaysia because of the large numbers of visitors who cross the borders daily. For this, separate arrangements are being made by a bilateral joint working group. Existing travel and border restrictions will stay put. Singapore residents and long-term pass holders who had been to Hubei province in the last 14 days will serve a 14-day quarantine upon returning. Short-term visitors from these regions will not be allowed entry or transit through Singapore. Singapore residents and long-term pass holders who had been to the rest of mainland China, as well as France, Germany, Italy, Iran, South Korea and Spain in the last 14 days will be served a 14-day stay-home notice. Again, short-term visitors from these countries will not be allowed entry or transit through Singapore. However, short-term visitors who are ASEAN nationals will also be required to submit requisite health information for approval before travelling. Early jostling over constituencies have begun after the battle lines for the next general election were drawn last Friday. More than one opposition party indicated interest in GRCs like Bishan Toa Payoh and Pasir Ris Punggol. Interest has also been shown in SMCs like Marymount and Mountbatten, setting the stage for potential three-cornered fights. But following the release of the new electoral boundaries, opposition parties called on the government to not hold a general election during the Covid-19 pandemic. 8 of the 11 opposition parties called for the election to be put off until the outbreak starts to taper off.
The Singapore Democratic Party called it an irresponsible act, saying that all state resources should be focused on dealing with the spread of the coronavirus. It added that PAP should not capitalise on the crisis and jeopardise public health.
Similarly, the Progress Singapore Party said that while the party is ready for an election at any time, Singapore should concentrate on fighting COVID-19 for now. Now, here to tell us about the seats to watch in the upcoming general election is news editor Zakir Hussain. Zakir, thanks for taking the time. Now, before we get into more detail, what do you think of the PAP calling for an election now amidst this COVID-19 situation? Is there a precedent of elections being called in times of crisis?
I think in Singapore, the last example we had was in 2001, when, soon after the September 11 attacks, and Singapore was in the middle of a slowdown. I think quite a bit of negative growth, and the prospects were quite bleak. I think former PM Goh Chok Tong decided, to seek a fresh mandate for the people to take decisive steps, and I think the PAP did resoundingly well, 75.3% of the votes. So on one level, there's the expectation that actually in a crisis, Singaporeans tend to flock for the safer option.
Yep.
And that's, I think, why some of the opposition parties feel that maybe this isn't the right time to call for an election.
Right. Well, Zakir, moving on, we have 4 new SMCs, Punggol West, Yio Chu Kang, Kebun Baru and Marymount.
That's right.
SMCs tend to be more keenly contested. How come?
I think there's a perception that SMCs might be easier to win. They've only got 20,000+ voters. Any sharp swings, could mean the chances, I think just going by the numbers, the chances of an unknown, or a fresh face toppling an incumbent are there. But having said that, that hasn't always been the case in many of the recent elections. And you've seen incumbents actually do much better in SMCs than the national average, for instance.
Now, Zakir, let's talk about the other big changes. Of course, residents in Balestier and Novena now being part of Jalan Besar GRC, as well as residents in the Nanyang ward of Choa Chu Kang GRC, and another close to 11,000 residents in Hong Kong North SMC will now come under West Coast GRC. A lot of changes. Now, how are these votes? How are these voters vote? Do you think, and do you see their voting patterns shifting?
I don't think they'll be very different from how voters in that area of Singapore kind of voted in the last few elections. PAP got strong support, over 70%. Although it's not, it's not sure how that might play out with Dr. Tan Cheng Bock likely to contest in the West Coast this time around. But there's a high chance, I think, with having more voters in a GRC, it'll be harder to unseat the incumbent.
Right. Well, Sengkang GRC, East Coast GRC could turn out to be hotly contested areas. Any predictions on how things may play out there?
I mean, I think you're likely to see the Workers' Party, both Sengkang and East Coast are joining Aljunied. You're likely to see the Workers' Party send probably its strong teams to both GRCs, They might send former Chief Low Tia Kiang or Aaron Chairman Sylvia Lim to, either of these GRCs. And they've had teams of, working the ground in these constituencies for some time. Sengkang West and Punggol East were quite actively contested by the WP in the past few rounds. So I think that those two seats are likely to be the ones to watch in this election.
Well, thank you so much, Zakir, for taking the time to speak with us. Always a pleasure. There was news editor Zakir Hussain for the Straits Times. Now, do let us know what you think about the upcoming election. Leave a comment below and visit straitstimes.com for the latest on the general election. Now, with Olivia Quay, I'm Dylan Ang, and join us tomorrow for more stories on The Big Story.